Solar panel wiring is the topic for today. Hi, this is Jim from RV4x40.com. Welcome back to the channel today. There's a lot of discussion on various forums, Facebook and other places, about how to wire for solar, in particular about the wire sizes you might need and what the implications are of larger wire, smaller wire, and series and parallel configurations and a number of other things like that. One of the things I developed in doing our own solar system was a spreadsheet that allows me to calculate, based on the length of wire and the power in the solar system, the right size wire to use if you want to look at power loss and voltage loss. Both of those are important parameters. So I want to make that spreadsheet available. There'll be a link down below, but it'll be on our website, RV4x40.com, along with a written version of this particular video. The idea is to give you a tool that allows you to look at different scenarios, different power levels for your amount of solar that you might have, and then how best to wire that so you can make trade-offs between wire size and wire length and the various components that might go into your solar system. It's not a detailed look at how to design all of that or how to install it, but what I want to do is give you a tool that allows you to look at the implications of using larger wire, smaller wire, shorter wire runs, longer wire runs, and various combinations that you can put together. The goal is to give you the tools to be able to make intelligent decisions about how much money to spend on the wiring versus the other components that go into your solar system. So take a look at how we go through and explain how to use the spreadsheet and give you some examples of that and some particular real-world applications of the spreadsheet. And if you have any questions, you can email me. Look at the end slate, give you an email address, and if we can answer your questions, we'd be happy to do so. Otherwise, we hope the spreadsheet is useful for you and you find it somehow it gives you some more information in putting your solar system together. But now let's go on and look at the applications of how we can calculate various parameters for solar systems and what you might use our spreadsheet for to do that. By now you may have figured out that there are different ways to wire your solar panels. You can put them in series, you can put them in parallel, or some combination of the above. If you're not familiar with those terms, let's just look at a small array of 4 solar panels. And this is a series connection. It's much like a series connection in batteries. You hook the plus side of one to the minus side of the other, and you have one wire going from the plus side and the other wire from the final minus side going into a combiner on the roof. In this case, you might not even need a combiner because there really isn't much to combine, but we'll leave that in our block diagram because it becomes important when we look at other configurations. This is a parallel configuration. There, all of the pluses are hooked together, and this is in this schematic shows that they're wired from the rightmost panel to the left one, to the third one, to the fourth one, and then one single wire going into the combiner. And the same thing on the negative side. The problem with actually wiring this way is each time you add in a solar panel, you're adding in the current for that panel into the wire. So to keep the wire losses more reasonable, each time you add in a parallel connection on this type of an arrangement, you really should increase the wire size from there to the next panel and then to the next panel, and finally the larger wire size going into the combiner itself. Again, you might not need a combiner in this kind of situation, but we put it in there for completeness sake. If you're going to do a parallel configuration, this is where the combiner becomes really important, because you would wire each of these devices, each of your solar panels, into the combiner with separate wires. That way the current flowing in each wire is just whatever that one panel can put out. And it might be 6 or 8 amps for some smaller panels. It might be more or less depending on your panel size. But you wire them all this way, and then the combiner is 2 bus bars, one that hooks together all the plus and the other that hooks together all the minus. And then you're going to use a larger wire size from that point down from the roof into wherever your solar controller is located. Like a lot of things in life, you can make it a little more complicated, and a lot of people will do series parallel connections. And this is our 4-panel array, so we can put 2 in series and then 2 in parallel. The wires only carry the current from 1 solar panel, so that's the minimum amount you're going to get based on your solar panel size. And you run parallel wires into a combiner, and then the combiner again has bus bars and a larger wire running down to the bottom. The benefits of doing this are, first of all, you raise the voltage coming out of the solar panels, and for the same amount of power, if you double the voltage, which you would do here, then you would have the current that has to flow because of that. You could put all 4 of them in series, and that might be okay, or you can put them all in parallel. That would be okay if you have the right wire size, or use some combination like this, which is a trade-off between voltage and current. The limitation with this system is typically the voltage rating of your solar controller, because each time you put a panel in series here, you're going to add that much voltage. These will be, say, 25-volt panels, and it's the open circuit voltage of the panel you care about. And so the 2 of them in series will give you 50 volts, 3 of them in series 75, 4 would give you 100. So you have to look at the solar controller you're using and see what its maximum input voltage would be. And then you use the open circuit voltage of your panels, because with no load flowing, that's the highest voltage you should see. And you want to make sure that that voltage is never above the maximum rating of your solar controller. Personally, I would say you want to have about a 20% margin as a minimum. So if you have a 100-volt controller, you'd never want to have more than, say, 80 volts going into it, just to protect the electronics, because the voltage stresses can be something that causes the controller to fail. So if these were 25-volt panels and you had a 100-volt controller, the maximum you could put in would be 3 of these particular panels. Now let's look at all of the elements that you're going to have in your solar system. You have the panels on the roof, and I have these in a series parallel arrangement to go to the combiners. And the heavier lines show that you have heavier wires going from the combiner down to your solar charge controller. And that size is important because that's going to be a loss of both voltage and power in the system. And your charge controller is going to take that input voltage, whatever it is, and then deliver the appropriate voltage to your battery system. And so again, you're coming in with a higher voltage and going out with a lower voltage, and so you'll have larger wires going out there. Then your largest wires are going to go from the battery array into your inverter, because that's going to be the highest current in the system depending on the size of the inverter. So let's look at what happens in this. We have higher voltages coming out because we have the series parallel arrangement. We get a higher voltage in any one panel, but the current in the wires on the roof are going to be whatever the current is from one panel when you wire things in this fashion. If you look at the wire going down, you now have a current increase because it's a number of series arrangements you have in parallel. Here we have 2 in parallel, so you'd have double the current. 3 would be 3 times the current, and so on, up to the maximum number of panels. You do have to have panels in this kind of an array where the numbers are divisible in the right ratios, so you can get the same number of panels in series and in parallel. So 4 panels you can put 2 in series, and then 2 sets in parallel. If you had 6 panels, you could put either 2 or 3 in series, and then either 3 or 2 in the parallel arrangement. So you can work that out to see what you have to do. When you look at the effect of the solar charge controller, and I'm ignoring any losses in the controller itself, there will be some, but now the current coming out of this charge controller is basically the voltage going into it is a string voltage divided by the battery voltage. So if you have, let's say, make the math simple, if you have 24 volts coming in and 12 volts going out, you would be doubling the current to get the same power out. If you had 3 times, you'd have 3 times the current. So you've now multiplied the current again by reducing the voltage, and you're doing it electronically, so that's a fairly efficient process. Lastly, if we look at what's going into the inverter, we're going to assume that your battery power is essentially unlimited. It can provide whatever current that your inverter needs. That's an important consideration in sizing the batteries. But now the solar system no longer controls that current. The amount of power you need going into your inverter is based upon the size of the inverter, what its maximum power that it can put out is going to be, and then what its loads are that are hooked up to it. So if you have a 3,000 watt inverter, you have to look at that. It may be able to provide 6,000 watts of a peak. And so you care about those wire sizes because you're going to have voltage drop. It is power loss in those wires, that is true, but sometimes a more important parameter is the battery voltage when the batteries are getting closer to discharge, and then the peak current the inverter needs to run, because the inverter will have a low voltage cutout. If your batteries drop down so far, the inverter will cut off to protect itself from a low voltage situation. Here we have the blank spreadsheet. We start out with it. You will see some of the parameters are shown as NA for not applicable, or others divide by 0. We don't have data in yet, so that's what we're going to see. So we start off with entering the panel data. We're assuming all the panels are exactly the same. Example is for a 160 watt panel, and from the nameplate we see that it's good for 8.62 amps at its maximum power output. And we put that number in, we see that that gives us a value of 18.6 volts at the maximum power point. Our controller should be controlling the panels to be at that point or very close to it if they're working correctly. We need the open circuit voltage to know what the stress might be on our controller, and again from the nameplate we see that these are at 24 volts. Now we have to look at exactly how we want to configure this particular array. We're going to assume for purposes of this that we have 3 panels in a series string, and that there are 2 sets of those in parallel, and that gives us a total of 6 panels. And down here you can see there's 960 watts available at 55.7 volts at the operating point, and 17.2 amps of output current, and a maximum voltage stress on our controller of 72 volts. And this is in red because we don't have a maximum controller voltage yet, so it's assuming it's 0, which is not going to be correct. When we look at lengths, we're looking at the length up to a combiner on the top of the roof. We're talking about the wire length. And the reason is these are not in matched pairs. You don't have a plus and minus going to the same place. So we have to actually measure out all of the wire we have combining all of these panels into the combiner itself where the bus bars are located. We're going to say that that's 60 feet in this particular case. Now we deal with one-way distances along the wire, and we'll double those since it's a round-trip path. So from our combiner on the roof down to the controller, let's say that we have 15 feet of that wire, and then more importantly from the controller to the battery, let's say that that's a 5-foot run of wire there. Parameter you'd like to have, and it's not always available, is controller efficiency. We're going to assume a number of 98% for our particular controller. Now for the charge voltage, we have to understand how batteries charge and what they're actually can be charging at while the power is being delivered. You may have the bulk voltage set at 14.4 volts, but typically the charger will not deliver that voltage until near the end of the charge cycle. So I'm going to say we're going to get 13.8 volts into these batteries while they're under heavy charge. That's our operating voltage. We want to know the maximum current we can get out of our controller, because we want to make sure that we don't run into that as a limitation in our charge current. And so this happens to be a 90 amp controller we're looking at, and we're going to say it's a 100 volt maximum input. And so now our numbers down here turn black. I would recommend that you never get above about 80%. It's not a hard and fast number, but given the way the stresses work on the controller, it's good to have some margin between these two numbers. And so that takes care of getting our controller in place. Now we're going to talk about the inverter itself. Becomes important in some of the wiring issues we're going to have. Let's say we have a 2,000 watt inverter, and again, efficiency is something you'd like to get. We'll assume a 98% conversion efficiency for that. It need to make sure that's a good number. Now we need to know where the low voltage cutout is, or where the inverter quits working, and that'll vary with the inverter, and the lower it is, the bigger wire you're going to need to handle that voltage drop. So we're going to say in this case that that's an 11 volt dropout on that. And so now we know that we're going to be pulling 186 amps when the batteries are getting close to discharge. If this number were higher, this would be lower, and conversely it goes the other way. So now we have a very important parameter, which is how far is the wiring distance from the battery to the inverter. We're going to say that that's 4 feet in this particular case. Now then, this wire size over here, entered it in the wrong place, so we'll take that one back out. That's not a useful number. So when we get to wire size up here, most solar panels tend to come with 10 gauge wire, and it's a little bit harder to change that. You have to take the panels apart to do it, and usually that's a pretty good number, especially in a series parallel string. So we'll put that in, and we see that we've got a total of a 0.54 volt loss out of our 55 or so volts. So power loss is a more important number perhaps up here. It's 0.5% of our total power, so not too bad in terms of what our efficiency loss is. More importantly, now we got to go from the controller down, and we're going to have about 17 amps in that, so we want maybe a little bit larger wire size. Let's plug in number 8 wire and see what that shows us. Okay, we've got a little bit higher percentage loss, a little bit lower voltage loss because of the shorter run and a slightly larger wire size. So because the current's up and power loss goes up as a square current, that's what we got. So we can leave that. We might say we want a little less voltage loss, in which case we could put this down to number 6 wire, and that does drop our loss down percentage wise a little bit, and the voltage loss as well. Importantly now is we've got a high current situation we're going to have coming out, and so we want to look and see what the wire size is from our converter. Let's make that relatively large for that application, because we're going to have a lot of current flow in there. Let's make it 4 gauge wire and see what happens. Well, okay, we did that. We got a 1.3% power loss, and we've got a 2% loss in our converter itself. So that may be perhaps a bit large on the wire size. I like to keep all these numbers under 1% just as a rule of thumb. So let's go with 2 gauge wire, and that gets us under 1%. We can come back and look at this again and see if that's what we want to do, but right now we'll put 2 gauge wire in there. So we know we've got 67 amps flowing into our system, and our wiring loss is under 2%, and our total loss is under 4%. So now we want to look at a parameter in terms of the battery banks we have, and let's say that we had 4 200 amp hour lead acid batteries in there. Lead acid batteries, you don't want to run them below about 50%. So if we had 400 amp hours of capacity, let's say we're charging 200 amp hours back into the batteries, because we've been good at managing our battery capacity. If we do that, we've got 3 hours to get a full charge, and this number assumes that all of the 67 amps is going into the batteries. One thing to think about when you're sizing a solar array is if you're pulling power during the day, let's say you're pulling 10 or 12 amps out of that, then this current will not be that much into the batteries. The solar array is delivering that, but you're thieving out part of it instead of going into the batteries, going into other loads. So that will stretch this time out based on what that is. Right now we're just looking at charge the battery, so I'm not going to do anything about that. If on the other hand we had, say, lithium batteries in here and we used up all of their capacity, which Battleborns you can do, we'd need 400 amp hours, which doubles that to 6 hours of time. So we could barely be able to charge up those batteries from a full discharge with nothing else going on in the course of a day. You can figure 5 to 6 hours is as much you're going to get in full charge, and you get more charge out of that, but it tapers off in the morning and the evening. So right now we've got something what we can probably live with as far as this is concerned. But let's go look and see what happens now from the battery to the inverter. This is our high current. At 2,000 watts, we're pulling 186 amps, and we got to keep that voltage above 11 volts. So let's plug in. Here you need, for a larger wire size, it tells you up above, you need a single quote or an apostrophe, and then we'll put in 1/aught wire just to kind of see where that gets us. Well, it gets us into a kind of a working condition. We're losing almost as much power in that wire as we lose in our entire system up above at 3.6%. So We might want to consider going a little bit bigger than that. We've also got a 0.15 voltage loss, so we're working at 11 volts, so we're losing 10% of our voltage in the wiring. I would submit that this is one of the more critical places, in that 1 aught wire, even for a 2000 watt converter, is not what you want to be. So let's change that to 2 aught and see what happens. So now we're still down to a 0.12 loss and 2.3%. So that may or may not be suitable for your application with 2000 watts. The other thing to think about is this is a running steady state. A lot of inverters are sized, if they're a 2000 watt inverter, they'll give you 3,000 or 4,000 peak watts, in which case this voltage loss would double. The power loss would go up by a factor of 4, but the voltage loss would double. So if you have a situation where the inverter delivers a lot of peak power, you might want to consider going up even more to handle that peak power situation. And the largest thing we have in the table is 4 aught wire. And if we do that, we're down to a 1.4% power loss and only under 1/10 of a volt. So in this situation, I would recommend actually even going to 4 aught wire, at least 2 aught wire, to keep yourself in a reasonable situation. So let's put this back at 2 aught. We'll save ourselves a small amount of money, not very much given the length of wire we need. And then let's look at some of the other parameters up here. If we wanted to change this wire up here, it's a little more difficult, but at most we're going to get a 0.5% of the power out of it. This number 6 wire coming down is 0.4%. This one's easier to change. Let's make that 4. And as you can see, we get a very small increase in current going from 6 to number 4. You could go to number 2 wire here, and you're only getting it down to 67.2 amps. Versus our original up here of number 6 wire is you're only getting a couple of tenths of an amp. So you can play with the spreadsheet and make a decision for what's worth it and what's not worth it to you. The wire to the converter, again, we're at 2 aught. What happens if we put in a 1 aught wire there? Yeah, we pick up a little bit more. So that's something to be considered between your controller and the battery. You might even say, let's go to 2 aught wire and see what that looks like. And you're getting down to the point where the law of diminishing returns is going to apply to all these numbers. So that gives us the same percentage loss as we have in our number 6 wire coming down, and a little less than our 10 gauge wire. So we've kind of balanced our wire losses by making those wire sizes. That's not a bad place to be. The converter efficiency, we really can't do much about that other than buying a better converter perhaps. And you may see claims for higher efficiencies, and you have to deal with those if the claims are real in your situation or if they're at some unusual operating condition. So that's a set of parameters that I think would be usable, would be livable. You can still consider the wire size down here, perhaps make that bigger if you wanted to or needed to. But there's a set of parameters. So it's that quick. And again, you can see we can go back and let's say, for example, what would happen if we could move the controller closer to the battery by a couple of feet, and we make that 3 feet instead of 5 feet. Well, we pick up another 1/10 of an amp, not a lot of charging current, so it's not a big, huge increase to go from 3. Let them get the other way and said, what if we had to be 8 feet away? We go to 67.2 versus our 5 feet, we're at 67.3. And at 10 feet up here, again 67.1. So we're not making a lot of difference with this large wire. If we have to go further, it would be more pronounced if we had a smaller wire in there. So it's probably a good idea to look at all these parameters. If your charging voltage went up a little bit, then your current would go down, the wire would be a little bit different. We have no problems with our controller we have plenty of room for growth, and you might want to think about that when you're looking at these wire sizes. I've got 6 panels in here. What happens if we could add another set of panels up here, and instead of 3 panels in string and 3 in parallel, we'd have to add 3 panels, which is kind of hard to do. If we added 2 panels, we could make this a 5. Make it a 4, adding 1 panel to each. And our controller, we're up almost to the margin we want to be at. We still have a little bit kind of you have to consider if you wanted to do that, or have some other arrangement up here. Now we have 8 panels, and so that's one way to do it. And those are all the numbers. You can take a look at what we've done to all the parameters, and we're up now to 89 amps. So we're running right up against the limit of our 90 amp controller. So that's probably as many as we can do. The other thing we could look at is make it 2 here and 4 there, keeping us at 8 panels. So now we're at 88.6 and we're only at 48 volts. So again, the wire sizes up here are fine. The wire size here is getting a little bit kind of where we like to be. Let's see what happens with number 4 wire. Well, we're still, let's go with even number 2 wire on that. It gets us down to 0.5%. And this one down here, we definitely want to go up to a 4/0 wire on that. And so now we're up at almost at 90 amps with that arrangement. That's where our controller starts to run out of steam with what we can do. If we went much further, we'd run into the controller. And in the real world, it's possible with that close of a margin, under some conditions, you would have the controller limiting your capability for charging the batteries, not the wiring and the other parts of the system. And we still got our 2,000 watt inverter, so those numbers don't change down here. You can see, well, what happens if I had a 3,000 watt inverter down here? Maybe that's what I want. Well, now I'm up at a 0.18. That's a lot of voltage loss. So we go back and look at 4/0 wire in that situation and get us down to still a 10% voltage loss, which is kind of on the high side, and certainly that's at 278 amps. You'd want to use the 4/0 wire. Again, the spreadsheet is there. You can play different parameters. You can play what happens if I, for example, went to, let me go back to my original 3 and 2, but what happens if I upgraded my panels themselves? There are 200 watt panels available. And so now with only 6 panels, I'm up to 84 amps. So that might be something to be considered. I probably don't need 2 gauge wire coming down there. Put that back up at maybe 4 gauge, maybe even 6 gauge for that. And still reasonable losses in that configuration at 0.3%. My 4/0 wires, I still need to be that on both of the other locations. I'd like to actually almost have bigger wire for that down there, but that becomes into some really specialized wire if you go larger than 4/0. So again, there are different parameters. You can play different scenarios, save them off as different conditions, so you've got them for records and can compare things in a slower time period. I hope you found it helpful. Thanks for joining us today on this exploration of wire sizes and some details that may be far more in-depth than some of you would want to have, but hopefully some of you will find it useful. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, we'd appreciate it if you would click on the subscribe button down below and join us as we travel around the highways and byways of America and enjoy your solar system, and we hope to meet up with you somewhere as we travel.